why don't we go ahead and get right into this. Give me one split second here. So, first of all, why don't you go ahead and tell us about yourself and a little bit about your background and how you got into this particular field and what you've been doing in this field for the last, 5 or 10 years.
Great. So I would say that my interest in food and food and healing started back in the 1970s when I was just a child. So I had one of those mothers that was considered at that time to be a health nut. So she was into Adele Davis, Richard Simmons. We had homemade food almost every night. So it was something that was kind of an anomaly then. It really wasn't like it is now, where food is very trendy, especially healthy food. So I would say that initially I was kind of, I would say, polarized to that message because it wasn't cool to be healthy and it wasn't cool to eat good, healthy food. So as I got older, I went into science and I began studying more. I thought I would be a doctor, like a medical doctor. And so I was studying pre-med, but then I soon came to realize that if I really wanted to affect change, I needed to understand the root causes of why people get sick. And one of those causes is truly looking at nutrition. So I went on to graduate school. I have a master's in human nutrition. I also have a Ph.D. in medical science. I worked with Dr. Jeffrey Bland, who is well, people call him the father of functional medicine. I worked with him for 10 years. I worked in a clinic setting for some time. I worked in the food industry. I would say that my background is that I've had a little bit of a menu of all these different experiences around food and eating. And yeah, even the definition of healthy food does vary. And at the time in the 70s, it was more about the white or dead kind of a thing. So I would say, my books, and I have 7 books, and I just came out with my latest one. It's all about colors of food. So the last book that just came out is called The Rainbow Diet. So I think that there's a lot of polarization within nutrition. A lot of people can argue what is healthy, what is not. And I would say that 20th century nutrition is all about eat this, not that. And 21st century nutrition is all about looking at the individual, looking at genetics, looking at environment, considering epigenetics, considering accessibility and tolerance of certain foods. So I would say that there's a lot more that goes into the equation now than probably did in the past. And one of the topics that I teach a lot on, especially within functional medicine, is metabolic detoxification. So the planet is becoming more toxic. The planet is filling with things like plastics and metals, and whatever the planet accumulates, our bodies accumulate. So we need to consider that in our food choices.
All right, beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing about yourself. And give me one second here. Just trying to get all squared away here. So, what are some of the most common misconceptions you encounter regarding the role of diet and nutrition in managing or reversing various diseases, such as autoimmune diseases?
I think it gets back to that there's just one way to eat. I think you really have to personalize a way of eating to the individual, just like an autoimmune way of eating would look very different than when you're focused on a cardiovascular way of eating, or if you're trying to really target the brain health. But I would say that there are some underlying foundational principles, but then there can be some minor changes. And that could even be connected to food allergies. Not everybody can tolerate the same foods. So for example, things that we might consider to be healthy, like let's just take walnuts. People can be allergic to walnuts, right? So that may not be good for everybody. And I also think we have to look at the health of the gut, because not everybody can digest foods properly. And so there's a lot of healing that needs to happen in the gut for us to tolerate foods and to kind of tone down the immune system as well.
Great. For individuals feeling overwhelmed by the vast amount of information available on diet and disease, as well as health, What are your top three most important pieces of advice for getting them started on that path for vibrant health?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. Can I have four pieces of advice?
You,
Because
you
in
can
a
have
rainbow
you can have four,
diet,
you can have seven, you can have seven.
well, I think that there are four. I talk about four in the rainbow diet. And the first one is the obvious one, to eat colors. So most people are not getting the sampling of the spectrum. They are getting mostly brown, yellow, and white foods. And, especially for breakfast, pancakes, waffles, toast, cereals, a lot of refined carbohydrates, a lot of processed foods, not a lot of color. The color tracks to nature's compounds, the phytochemicals. When I went to graduate school, we learned a lot about protein, carbohydrate, and fat, and not as much around these phytochemicals. And now we are learning that there are these compounds within plants that don't have calories, but they have activity in our cells. So each of the colors of food stands for a certain function in the body. So red foods help with inflammation and immunity. Orange foods, we want to think about protecting our skin, our brain, our reproductive health. Yellow foods connect mostly with, if we think about gut health. Green foods, the heart. If we think of blue purple foods, that's typically the brain. So there's a color code to nature's foods. So that's why number one is color. Number two is diversity. It is so important to diversify your intake of foods, diversify your life experiences, diversify just about everything. The more that we can shake things up and get out of ruts, the better our brain, heart, and gut respond. So, some of the science suggests that we need something on the order of 30 to 50 unique foods in 7 days in order to foster a healthy gut milieu and a healthy gut microbiome. So our gut, when it's working well, it likes diversity. The same things over and over again won't give us the host of different phytonutrients and other nutrients that we need in order to have a strong gut microbiome. The third principle that we need to look at is rhythm. And what I mean by rhythm is circadian rhythm. The time of day that you eat can make a huge difference. You can have a very healthy meal late into the evening, and it may not be so healthy for your sleep. So considering the timing of eating is really essential. The other thing is, from a rhythm perspective, looking at the seasonality of foods. So we know that, at least from some of the studies, preclinical studies, that if you eat foods out of season, you can be giving the body a different signal than what it really needs. Then I would say the fourth principle, I saved this one for last because it really gets into what I see is that for some people, food becomes analysis paralysis. There's so much that we have to think about when it comes to eating. And so over the years, working with people and doing workshops and retreats and one-on-one sessions and all of that, what I have learned is you have to make eating artful. It needs to be enjoyable. It has to be creative. So creativity is the fourth principle. Just you have to have a bit of fun together with the factual part of eating, because otherwise it just becomes stressful. And I have seen that happen all too often with people.
What
So
would
those
be
are
what would be an example of fun?
so I created a card deck because I was seeing that people needed ways to create more fun. So the card deck has many colors and different inspirational phrases about food. You put it on the dining room table, you pick a card with your meal, and you really just connect to the inspiration of the meal. It could also mean playing with your food, meaning that as children, I bet many of us were told not to play with food. I know I was. And so it was like there was this seriousness about food. So I think, especially engaging children with having fun in preparing food, like making a rainbow pizza, making a rainbow smoothie, and reflecting on all of those colors. Usually, when I'm working with people, I'll ask, "What's your favorite color?" And just about everybody has some connection to a color. They know the color that they like a lot, and then they know the color that they also don't like as much. So you can have a little bit of fun with the colors of food, with spices, with herbs, with creative combinations of foods, especially having people buy a food that they haven't had in a long time or maybe ever, and getting creative about how to prepare it. Maybe it's also, I used to teach a university course and it was called Nutrition for the Soul. And one of their assignments was to eat a meal with their hands that they wouldn't normally eat with their hands. And I remember the students would come back and I asked them, how was that experience? What did you do? And one woman in the class ate a salad with her hands. And she said it was so messy, but it enabled her to get a more of a connection to the food, and she would feel the texture of the food. Yes, it was messy, but it's like it affected her at a different level. And sometimes I think we need to get messy. There's a lot about being neat, being perfectionistic, being structured, and oftentimes the insights come within the creative chaos. So bringing a little bit of that into your kitchen, and not only the analytical, structured parts, but the fun, creative parts. So, and maybe it's even like painting your kitchen. I had a client many years ago. She had a lot of gut issues, a lot of inflammation, and she never liked to be in her kitchen making meals. And I asked her, I said, can you describe your kitchen for me? I'm just kind of curious. What does it feel like and look like? And she said, oh, it's all white. It's really sterile and it's clean. And I asked her, I said, well, what is your favorite color? And she immediately said, sage green, like that deeply hued kind of a foresty green.
Mhm.
And so I said, well, what would happen if you painted your kitchen sage green? And she kind of looked at me like she didn't expect me to say that. And she came back after like 3 weeks and she was smiling. And I said, so how's it going? What's happening for you with food? And she's like, well, I have to tell you, I painted my kitchen sage green and I love it. I love to be in my kitchen now. I think she called it a sanctuary. So it was
Wow.
kind of like, for some people, I think they get totally stressed out. The kitchen is just another place of stress. It's not fun. So you have to figure out, how do you make your kitchen a sanctuary? How do you make it a place you want to be? Like my windowsill in my kitchen is filled with all kinds of little things that have meaning. Whether it's like, I have like this heart, gifts from people. I have a card from somebody, and it rotates. Like things take on different meanings at different times. And also just, Annette is saying eating with her hands. I mean, that's great. Eating with friends, eating with community, especially if you're a solo eater. When I lived in Europe many years ago, a European tradition is to invite people to dinner just like in the middle of the week. And you don't make it like a big production. You just have them over for kind of like a simple stir fry or something like that. And that also can create a lot of fun too, right? Not something that requires over the top preparation, but enables community.
Great. So, and you mentioned um, there's a kind of a pressure or societal, or cultural norm of being perfect or neat with your food, which kind of brings up the topic of something Michael Pollan calls orthorexia.
Yeah,
People are
I know all
obsessed
about
with
it.
eating correctly. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
sorry. I didn't hear what you
that's
said.
very common these days, right? People want to get it right. And so orthorexia is an obsession with healthy eating to the point that it becomes almost pathological, right? It's not healthy to always be fixated on eating healthy. I have a good friend, and he would say that he would aim for 80% of his eating to be spot on, but then to have a little bit of wiggle room so that he didn't get stressed out. Like maybe have a pizza every month but you can really create kind of a more nutrient dense pizza too. It's not like you have to completely refrain from things. But for some people, if you're allergic or intolerant, you just have to find creative substitutions. But yeah, orthorexia, I would say that's actually something, because my mother was so restrictive in our eating. I did develop an eating disorder in my teenage years, which was really impactful on my psyche. And then I almost, when I went the other way and started studying nutrition, I almost had to prevent myself from getting too deeply entrenched into what you're saying, the orthorexia aspect. You displace one obsession for another. So, it has taken, and I think that's where the fun comes in. If we can make sure that we have fun, creativity, play with our food and don't get too fixated on the outcome, because food is not the only thing that impacts our health. Stress is also a huge driver of health and how we digest food.
And what do you see what happen dietarily when people are stressed?
Well, then they have typically more immune responses to food. And I've seen that over and over again. So even the foods that they were able to eat before, now they have an issue with because they're stressed out. When you're stressed, you can create leaky gut. So what that means is that if you have leaky gut, you are going to have some degree of inflammation. So having a huge bout of stress can really provoke that response in the gut, which leads to less digestion, less absorption, and less assimilation. So maybe you went through all of the work to have this healthy meal, but now you can't properly take it in and process it. So it's always really good to synchronize. And if you're feeling stressed out, there are so many things for that too. But I feel like one thing that works really well with food is breath work. Because when you're breathing, usually people that are stressed, they're not breathing properly. They're breathing very shallowly. And what do we need to actually metabolize food? We need oxygen. So then we don't get the satiety signal, right? The vagus nerve and the alignment with our gut is not optimal. So it's really important to look at stress response and food intake.
And what are other causes of leaky gut?
Toxins, as an example, goodness, any number of toxins. We have so many to be thinking about. I don't want to leave everybody with a depressing message, but because there are some things that we should be aware of course, like toxic metals, arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, the obvious things that are circulating out there in food, air, and water. But then we also have plastics. We have microplastics to think about. This does change the health of the gut, right? And so what's the antidote to that? Because those toxins are pervasive, right? We can't avoid them. What we can do is provide fiber, different kinds of fiber. And one of my best practices about fiber is to rotate different fibers. So whether it's psyllium, flaxseed meal, chia seeds, have different fibers because each of the fibers has different properties, and some of them like certain toxins more than others. So they will bind the toxin and then take it out of the body, right? So really important to be thinking about that. So yeah, stress, if we have any kind of pathogen like a virus, a bacterium, any kind of invader can also be causing that. If we have an unhealthy gut microbiome, which is called dysbiosis, where we have more bad guys than good guys in the gut, that can just chronically lead to the production of a lot of what is called endotoxin. Endo meaning that we make it ourselves in our body. And we know that we have a lot of these microorganisms in the gut, right? So they can really change our gut health, but then also whatever they make in response to what we take in can influence our brain, can influence our overall body, because that stuff then moves into the body through the blood.
Great. And what about resistant starch? Is that the same? You kind of add in resistant starch just like you would with fiber?
Yeah. Yeah, I would add that to like the laundry list of all the different kinds of fibers to rotate in. You have, basically how I think of fiber is it's either like a mop or it's like a broom. So the moppy fiber is the kind that swells with water, right? So when you take in water with fiber, it makes like a gel and then it starts to trap things. And that's really important for healthy blood sugar response and also trapping some of these toxins. And then the broom like the insoluble fiber, like bran coatings and such. They just kind of help with the movement of the gut. So that's really important. So with resistant starch, that's nice because that acts as kind of the material for the gut microbiome to work on. Another thing that is great for the gut. So let me just go back. When I think of the gut, I think of a 3P approach: prebiotics, which we're talking about now, then the probiotics, which you can get from whether it's yogurt, kefir, or other fermented products, or even a supplemental probiotic. The third thing is polyphenols. Polyphenols are in herbs, spices, berries, cocoa. They're also in things like nuts, like walnuts and pomegranate. And these polyphenols are also broken down by the gut bacteria in order to create certain metabolites to help things like our gut-brain axis.
Thank you. And what are ways, given that we have all these toxins, you mentioned fiber and resistant starch now, what are other ways to detox our body?
Greens. Green is a great color for detoxification. So when I think of green, I think of matcha tea, I think of chlorella and spirulina. I think of just even the standard leafy greens of any variety thereof, like arugula and lettuces of different kinds, which have phytochemicals, but they also are rich in folates, vitamin K1, magnesium, which are all required in order to effectively detoxify. So that's important. So the greens are important. And Laura also has a question about, gut health. If we think about toxin load of children and that affecting school performance, definitely we can see a connection between autistic spectrum disorder, whether attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. We can start to see that the brain is affected by the toxin load. And sometimes that is even transferred through pregnancy and through birth from the mother, right? So I would say that for children's health, we need to start with the parents. We need to start further back before conception so that the mother is healthy before giving birth and before nursing, because a lot of those toxins like fats. And so they'll come out through the breast milk, they'll come out in the fatty tissue. So it's just important to be looking at those things.
And maybe I missed it as far as like toxins that we have or issues, like things that we're eating that are detrimental to the gut. What about glyphosate and other pesticides?
Absolutely. Pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, all of the things that are on things like produce or even just circulating in the environment and then make their way into animals, right? And like I just mentioned, many times they go into fat tissue. So glyphosate is part of that, but actually that's just like a little that's one of many. There are so many different pesticides to be thinking about, which is why it's really important, when at all possible, to get organically grown food, because you will minimize the toxin load of that food. The way I like to think about organic food is as health insurance. It's kind of like the small amount that you pay throughout a week for the lifetime benefit. Because when those pesticides build up, we see now that they are implicated in chronic diseases. So they may increase the risk for things like type 2 diabetes, neurodegenerative conditions. So, health is wealth. And I know that we all want health so that we can live a good quality of life. So making those choices whenever we can is really important. And if we can't afford it for some reason, I would say going to the Environmental Working Group website, which is ewg.org, and looking at the Dirty Dozen, the Clean 15, right? So that you can strategically pick. I would say just in general that whenever it comes to berries, buying organic is pretty important, because berries are hard to wash. They are typically contaminated, especially strawberries. Raspberries are too difficult to wash. They start to fall apart. So buying organic berries would be a very important one to be thinking about, just regardless, right? You can buy frozen berries. Many people ask me about, well, what's more important? Canned foods. We know that the cans are lined with different plastic liners. We know that that's not good. But frozen actually tends to fare quite well for certain foods, especially berries. So I think keeping those on hand for when we're not able to get them in season is a good thing.
And you mentioned eating seasonally. What are foods that are most detrimental to eat out of season? What are foods that are really important to eat in season?
Well, I don't know if I would use the word detrimental. I would say if we ate foods in season, it's almost like we optimize that food with our bodies, especially if we don't travel a lot. Like, let's just say that we're pretty much stationary, we're in the same area most of the year. Whatever is grown locally, we would want to be getting those foods because number one, they have less of a footprint. They're usually coming from local areas, which it can be a good thing. So I live in the Pacific Northwest. Let me just give you an example here. So here, year round, pretty much we have a lot of greens. We have a lot of berries in the late summertime. We have a lot of salmon. And so it's like, you kind of have to look at what is in your area. I don't have access to a lot of tropical fruits like mango and pineapple here. So that really probably wouldn't be best fit for my physiology living here. But if I lived in Florida, where it's much warmer, and so looking at greater consumption of things like citrus fruits, where the season for them would be longer, and many times they're grown during that time. There are some animal studies to suggest that when certain foods are eaten out of season, they may dysregulate how we metabolize fat and how we store and how we overall metabolize. But these are animal studies, these aren't human studies. And most people aren't really just eating one food out of season all the time. Maybe they have an orange in the winter occasionally, but you don't want to buy a big bag of oranges when you're living in Chicago and it's cold and it's winter time, right? Because oranges would be out of season. And when you eat foods out of season, it's like telling your body that it's a different season and it's got to do different things. So I used to work with a physician. His name was Dr. Jack Kornberg. And I remember him talking about oranges and eating oranges in the winter and how it's like telling the body to store fat that it's summer to get ready for winter,
Oh,
right? So again, I don't want to discourage eating an orange occasionally in the winter months, but again, this gets back into diversity. You want to shake up the foods that you're eating on a routine basis. Now, some of my favorites that I do want to mention would be grapes in the fall, early winter months, apples during the September, October months. Apples and grapes have certain polyphenols that would help our body to acclimate better, potentially, to the circadian shifts that come with the winter. And then cherries would be a great food for the spring, as well as, springtime, I typically think about detoxification. I think about the liver starting to clear and clean house, so to speak. So cilantro, a lot of spring greens. This is the time where we start to look at what is growing above ground versus in the ground, like the tubers and potatoes and different starches. So, this is not new, by the way. I mean, gosh, eating according to traditional medicine, Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, they have long acknowledged this. It's only, I would say, in the past decades that the science is catching up, and it makes good sense. I mean, from many different aspects, from a planetary perspective, and also keeping us in sync with nature.
so for somebody who wanted to eat in rhythm and follow seasonal foods, what would be a good resource for them to check out? Do you have a good website that people can go to?
There are a number of different websites. Gosh, if you just Google, eating in season or seasonal food guide, and a number of them have where you can put in your zip code, and then you can kind of get a list depending on where you're at. It's a little bit different for people who live internationally, but that can be very easy to find online. And you know what? Here's the other thing. Talk to your grocer. I gotta say, the produce people, people that work in the produce section, typically they'll put tags on what is local or in season, or you can talk with them because that food is going to be freshest and it's going to be more nutrient dense. So ask the people in the produce section to give you the guide on that.
So now you said about, I got two things about citrus in the wintertime. One, you said about storing fat, which probably scares people. Does when eating citrus fruit, does it tell your body to store fat?
Well, there was an animal study that showed that oranges given to animals at different times where their body was mimicking either winter or summer did create a shift in metabolism. Does that happen in people? We haven't actually seen that. So I wouldn't get too nervous about it. But again, I think we need to bank on goodness, the hundreds, if not thousands of years of traditional wisdom telling us about how important it is to eat seasonally. There are just certain compounds that we need at certain times of year. Let's go back to citrus for a second. Citrus tends to be high in vitamin C. Vitamin C is a really important water-soluble antioxidant. What happens in the summer? We tend to sweat. We tend to release and excrete more vitamin C. We might be in the sun more, having more ultraviolet radiation exposure. We might need more in the way of certain antioxidants, whether it's for the skin or for different body systems. So there might actually be a reason to have that vitamin C from citrus, because citrus has a beautiful natural blend of not just the vitamin C, but also the bioflavonoids that work together with the vitamin C to have activity in the body. So many times that combination helps things like capillaries. Think of it, in the summer, you tend to be more active, greater circulation, right? So you want to support capillary health, blood vessels. So vitamin C in that way could be more important. Whereas in the winter, there isn't as much connection to the sunlight. There isn't as much movement, which can be a problem for some people, right? But in Florida, let's just take Florida again, where you have more sun throughout the year, you're more active throughout the year, you may be needing more vitamin C and these bioflavonoids as a result of those changes in your behavior. So that's kind of how I'm connecting all of the dots.
And just one last thing on the citrus. I remember as a kid, and I would imagine you might as well, that people used to send oranges from Florida to people up north as a gift during the wintertime. Why, and I believe it was for nutritional purposes. Why was that, if you
Well,
recall?
as you said, it might be for nutritional purposes. Maybe people just aren't getting enough in the way of their vitamin C, or they're stressed out. Usually during the holidays, people get stressed, right? So we look at the month of December. Usually people aren't eating very well. They're stressed. They're not sleeping to their full amount. So that maybe what the thought was there is that we're boosting and helping the body a little bit with its antioxidant status. And you know what else? Here's the other thing. Oranges. Have you ever been on an airplane and you take out an orange or a mandarin or a tangerine and you start to peel it, and it just infuses the airplane with that beautiful smell? So I think it also has an essential oil, kind of like an aroma aspect of encouraging better mood. At least that's just, not like a scientific study, but if you think about it, and the impact of citrus on, it's a pleasant smell. It's a pleasant experience to have an orange. And just the color orange is a very, orange is a warming color. It confers that sense of warmth and play. So there's a lot that goes on there. We're looking at color, smell, and then the sensory experience of something a little bit sweet and giving us antioxidants. And again, I don't want to leave everybody thinking that, oh my goodness, I should never have an orange in the winter. Again, that's not the case here. But when I see people buying like huge bags of oranges when they're not in season, and many times it doesn't even show up, but it does, because we go to grocery stores these days. In fact, I was just at Trader Joe's and I got bananas, and they were from Peru. right? I mean, you look at like how far away things are and how they're transported, and think of how less time growing, so less nutrient quality because they have to be shipped in the right amount of time so that they don't spoil. So the further away your food is from where you are, chances are you're going to have less nutrient density. Now, sometimes you just can't avoid this. Certain things just need to come from other areas, but there you go. You do your best. And again, go back to that principle of color. Make sure that you're just getting the variety of different colors all throughout the year, actually.
Great. So, food sensitivities seem to have gone through the roof in the last, I don't know, 30 years. Everyone's, so many kids are allergic to peanuts, and I think you have like the 8 allergens now, and it's gotten crazy. What do you attribute it to? Are there ways of clearing out those sensitivities to foods once they, you've identified that you have one?
Well, I don't think food looks the same that it looked like, even back in the 1970s. Foods are just different now. They're grown differently. They have, like we were just talking about, pesticides, insecticides, things like glyphosate. So you can ask the question, what are they actually responding to and reacting to? Is it the food? Is it their gut microbiome? Is it something else in the food? Is it a microorganism on the food? There are a lot of different questions. So there are different ways to work with a practitioner to rule a lot of those things out. One of the things that can be done is food allergy testing, where you can look at the actual immune response to a food. You can also do what's called an elimination diet, where you take out those 9 allergens. So sesame is like the newer allergen that has been added to the FDA list. So you could take out those 9, see how you do. And sometimes I take out things that aren't allergens, but people react to, like sugar, caffeine, alcohol. I think that those are 3 big ones that you really want to get a pulse check on. In fact, this is for everybody to think about. One of my nutrition mentors, her name is Barb Schultz. She had mentioned to me as I started to work more with people one-on-one, she said, Deanna, always ask the person, what would they not want to give up? What, during an elimination diet, would they never want to eliminate? Because many times that's the thing that they are most reactive to, that it's causing this opioid-like effect in the body, and it's creating this dependency. So I'll give you a quick story about that. One of the things that I have seen that people are most, I would say, dependent on, or they have a hard time giving up, would be cheese, bread, and I would say also coffee. I don't see coffee as necessarily a bad thing for all people. In fact, coffee can be quite medicinal, but coffee can also be toxic if it's not a very good brand with good growing, good storage, and good roasting processes, right? So then we can ask the question, is that not a good beverage for a person because of how they're metabolizing it? Or is there something in the coffee bean that they're reacting to? So sometimes, we kind of have to weed that out. So that's also an interesting experiment to do. So, and why are they reacting? It's just hard to say. I think that people living in 2025 are up against a lot more now than they were in like even the year 2000, or even in, you look at 1950. I think I saw the statistic somewhere that it takes, let's go back to oranges for a second. It just happens to be the example I have, but what you would get with one orange in, I think it was like the 1950s, you would now need 8 oranges to give you the same nutritional value. So food just isn't nutrient dense to the same level that we've known it to be. We need nutrients to help us to detoxify. So if we're going to come up short on nutrients, we're going to be higher on toxin load. And that higher toxin load is implicated in how our immune system functions. So back to things like food allergies, food intolerances, food sensitivities. And people get all kinds of things that happen to them when they eat foods. Like if you get bloated after a high protein meal, maybe it's actually you just don't have enough stomach acid, or you need a little bit more, digestive help. Maybe the reaction is because you have indigestion, maldigestion. And so then you get these larger proteins that the body starts to react to. So you always have to work with a practitioner to really get into the gut, do some testing. In functional medicine, we have what's called a 5R program: remove, replace, reinoculate, repair, and rebalance. So there's kind of a sequence of how you do this in order to get the gut back on track. And whenever we start with our health and we start down that health journey, it's really important to start with the gut, because the gut is the portal to all of the other organ systems.
So how would you go about, you mentioned that, the gut may need some help, or you mentioned stomach acid not being high enough. What do you do for those types of issues?
Well, first you have to figure out if that's actually the case. So, kind of trial and error. Are you not digesting protein? Are you bloating because you have an overgrowth in your gut? You've got too many microorganisms. So, every time you have a grain or a starch, you start to get bloated. This is pretty common. Small intestinal bowel overgrowth. That's also called SIBO. And with SIBO, that is not really a great condition for the gut, because now you start to get a lot of bad guys and less of the good guys. And those bad guys in the gut are creating gases, right? So there's a lot of like bloating in the upper part of the gut, and people start to get really distended, really uncomfortable. I've seen this over and over in people, like almost when women have it, it's almost like they just feel uncomfortable in their clothing. I've had one woman describe it as like she felt pregnant, because it was just such it would just get increased throughout the day. So it would start out like where, less bloating for breakfast, but then it sequentially increased throughout the day, depending on what was eaten. So I think you really need to get that straightened out. Like, are you bloated because of, is it low stomach? There are ways to actually decipher that and questions to ask and with a practitioner to kind of make sense of that a little bit more. Sometimes, bringing in things like pancreatic enzymes, having enzymes with meals, like enzymes to break down things like starch, fats, proteins. Right now the rage is to eat more protein. We hear that pretty much everywhere we turn. Oh, you're menopausal, more protein. Oh, you're a growing child, more protein. Oh, you're a man, you have low testosterone, you better eat more protein. Well, in order to digest the protein, there's a lot that has to happen there. So you can be eating a lot of that expensive protein, but then not properly digesting it. So then it just kind of goes to waste. So literally. So you really do want to ensure that you have healthy digestion. Having 1 to 2 bowel movements per day, no symptoms after a meal like bloating or distension or burping, acid reflux. I mean, just listen to your body, because if you've got some of these symptoms, that would tell you already that there's an imbalance somewhere.
How much protein do we need? Do we, all these prescriptions for additional protein, is that really necessary in most cases?
I think
Are
it
we
really,
protein deficient?
I think it depends. I do think that those groups I just mentioned do actually have more protein requirement needs, but it depends on the person. And again, it's just so hard to give like, the standard 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. I do think as we get older, when we're experiencing more breakdown of things like muscle, I think it is important to be looking at how much we are getting in our daily diet. I do think that that is important. I do think it's important for men as well to keep maintaining things like testosterone levels, because men go through a hormonal shift known as andropause, where things like testosterone come down, different androgens come down. So that impacts their mood, their ability to focus, their sense of drive. So yeah, but I think like anything else, you can't go overboard either. Like if you have too high a protein, then something else is going to go out of balance. Maybe you have too little fiber then. So everything has to kind of be in its proper balance. But for certain groups, I do think that protein can be increased because of need.
So you talked about gut health. How has the rise of the microbiome over the last, well, at least in the public consciousness in the last 10 years, affected your work and how you deal with people's, I mean, to use the word gut health, I think we wouldn't even be using that without the discussion of the microbiome. So how has that informed your profession and what you do?
Well, it's part, I mean, the gut microbiome comprises, I would say more, it's a greater population than cells of our own bodies, right? So it has the ability to change things like our mood, our behaviors, our appetite. You know, a lot is signaled from the gut. So that's why ensuring that we're taking in foods that build a good, healthy gut microbiome is really important. I feel like the gut microbiome has been talked about now for some time, and we have a pretty good handle on it. You can go to a functional medicine doctor, give a stool sample, and kind of get a sense of the genetic material of the different microorganisms that you've got in your stool. So that can be helpful. I don't think it's the be all end all. What I think is more important potentially is making sure that we're taking in foods that create naturally a good, healthy gut microbiome. So there's been, I would say, when we first started to learn about the gut microbiome, we became strongly focused on probiotics. Oh, let's make sure that we're giving these probiotics because we want this gut microbiome population. But now we know that those gut microorganisms don't stick around unless the environment is built properly. This is why we talk about tend to your terrain. The terrain is the environment in the gut. And if it is not a healthy environment, then you're not going to have good, healthy microorganisms sticking around. Because ideally, what you want is those microorganisms to adhere and to start to metabolize and to give you things like short chain fatty acids, like butyrate, which can be important for the gut health, as well as immune health, as well as brain health. So you build a better gut lining through things like prebiotics, like we've been talking about. So
Right.
the future, I think, is looking at not just the gut microbiome, but looking at the skin microbiome, looking at the nasal microbiome, the oral microbiome, the vaginal microbiome, the ocular microbiome, the scalp microbiome. We have, if you look at the work of Dr. Rob Knight, who is an expert in this area, he even looks at the face, you know, that we have different microbiota throughout. So that could be informing us in a variety of different ways.
And so he talks about microbiome of all different kinds, like not not just the gut microbiome, but all over the body, the various colonies of bacteria that we have.
Yeah, yeah, because they can all be very diverse. So let's just think about skincare. Wouldn't it be nice to be looking at sampling the skin to see how the microorganisms there are, again, producing certain metabolites that are changing things like skin acidity, the hydration, changing the hydration status. I do think that, and even when women go through menopause, their microbiome changes and it starts to look more like a man's microbiome. And that can impact us from the level of even things like detoxification. So, one of the first line defenses against the toxins that we ingest through food is a gut microbiome. The gut microbiome is there to take those things and metabolize them and get rid of them. So, if we, again, we need a gut microbiome that's truly working for us. I think that that's really important.
And what's the role of breastfeeding for establishing a healthy microbiome?
That's really important. You know, if we think about even children who are delivered vaginally versus C-section, there's a difference in their gut microbiome, right? Because they don't have the exposure of the vaginal microbiome. And then further, the transference of the microorganisms of the mother and colostrum and a lot of different proteins and even melatonin from the milk of the mother. which then all of which can inform the gut microbiome, even the melatonin that the mother produces if she's feeding her infant at night when her melatonin is high, because melatonin is it's lipid soluble. It comes out in fat. So yes, breast milk can play a role in establishing a healthy microbiome in an infant, but the degree to which that can happen depends on the health of the mother and what she's actually transferring.
Great, thanks. So, given all the sensitivities that people have, and they restrict this and they restrict that, how do you then achieve a wide range of nutrients in accordance with the concept that you talk about with regard to the rainbow diet?
Well, let's just back up into the elimination diet again. This is one of the first places to go when people feel like they may have some issues with their gut, or they have immune issues, or maybe they have autoimmunity and they really want to get a handle on their immune system in their gut, because most of your immune system is actually in your gut, right? So it's not that you are refraining from all foods for an extended time, but for 21 to 28 days, reeling back on certain foods, especially things like corn, soy, dairy, certain meats, like I mentioned, caffeine, alcohol, sugar, and just taking out a lot of those things from the diet, typically that you would find in an ultra processed food diet. And then after that, 3 to 4 weeks, adding back in foods one at a time and seeing how the body responds. So looking at things like, okay, do you feel joint pain after you eat that? Are your joints sore? Do you get a headache? Are your ears red? Do you have flushing? Do you have hives after you eat certain foods? Because all of that could be triggering you into thinking that, wow, I might be having a response here. So after you do that and you add back foods, right, then you start to get a new palette of foods that you can eat, and then you diversify. And in fact, I want to mention this. There are studies that show that infants that are fed a more diverse diet earlier in life have less chance for certain immune conditions as adults. So diversity is really important. And some of the reason I think that people have an issue with reactivity to food is because they have the same food over and over again and large amounts of it. So if you just had small amounts of many foods, chances are you're not going to react to the same degree as if you had, again, like a 2 slices of bread sandwich with cheese and a hamburger, like many different things in large proportion over and over again. So changing it up. So dietary diversity helps to protect against things like food sensitivities and even potentially food allergies, because it's helping the gut microbiome to be diverse, right? One of nature's principles is diversity. We know even from brain health studies, people that are more neuronally plastic or have more synapses communicating in their brain, they're doing diverse things, right? They're maybe reading different books, they're doing crossword puzzles, they're taking a different way to work in the morning. So diversity of food, diversity of life experiences, and even diversity of physical activity can be a good thing.
And talking about people eating the same thing, when you go, I'm plant-based, and one of the experiences that you have is like, what do you eat? Twigs and berries, and they think it's very limited. Where I tend to eat a tremendous amount of variety. How many meals does the average? Like, how many different types of meals does the average person eat?
Well, it's hard to say. There are different numbers that have been tossed out there, but typically people, if you look at the American Gut Project, people that have less than 10 kinds of foods per week versus those that have more than 30, the people that have less fare less well. They have less robust, like, immune systems, gut health, and those sorts of things. So in most people circulate among like 5 to 7 different recipes in a week. You kind of have your go-tos, right? It's like, oh, I'm gonna Wednesday is spaghetti day, or Thursdays are taco day. And so you kind of go with the same things over and over again. But you could do like a taco day, but then you can have different types of things in there. One of the ways that you can diversify very easily is through two things: herbs and spices. So when I talk about herbs, I'm talking also about herbal teas and different kinds of teas, which bring in a lot of different phytochemicals. And especially if they have a combination of different types of plants in them. And then when we think about spices, variety is the spice of life. And spices help food to taste better. And it also helps with giving us more phytochemicals. It's very protective. In fact, if you there was a study in which they had hamburgers, so they had the hamburger meat, and then when you put in spices before cooking, you can prevent the formation of certain carcinogens. So the spices are very protective. So they don't only make things taste better, they help to protect against toxins and other things that might form with the cooking process. And that's also something to think about, is what's called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. And these are, like food that has a crispy texture to it, like you put bread into a toaster and it becomes more brown, or you cook a pizza and the crust is brown, or cookies that have like that ridge that is more brown around the perimeter. That is actually inflammatory. There is so much that has been studied on advanced glycation end products. These browned products that form through grilling, baking, frying, and roasting and broiling are all upregulating inflammation in our bodies. So we may not be able to avoid those foods, but one of the things that we can do is bring in spices, because spices can help to offset some of those advanced glycation end products. In fact, there was a really neat study. It was done many years ago now, with Dave Heber at UCLA. And it was a hamburger study where they had people eat a burger. Then they measured how their inflammation went up after the burger. And then they had them come back to the lab and have the burger, but with half of an avocado. And they found that the inflammation flatlined just right after eating it. So you can actually eat smarter by having effective combinations of certain foods. So bringing in a plant can be very protective, especially that avocado, right? But then the spices could be great for just even you can create those advanced glycation end products even in grilled vegetables. That's why, when you put them on the grill and you get the kind of the singe of the black brown color, that tells you it's been damaged. That tells you that you now lost nutrients from the food, right? So it's important to protect that food with spices and cook your food slow and low, not in dry, hot heat methods like I described, but more like steaming, just gentle sauteing. If you need to boil something a bit, but not overextending that period, because then you start to lose some of the nutrient quality.
So in that example, you talked about the burger having, various properties to it that were detrimental, and then you had the plants come in and mitigate that. Should they be eating the burger in the first place, given that that they have those issues with it?
Well, some people just are. you know again, nutrition has been a series of right and wrong, like don't eat this, eat that. And I think that the middle path, the spectrum path, the rainbow path, is to say, if you're going to eat the burger, load it up with a bunch of plants, right? Load it up with the avocado, load it up with lettuce and spices, right? Because for so many people, they're not going to change what they're eating, but if you can help them to modify the effect on the body, that would be an important thing to do.
And so what about raw versus cooked foods? And then within the cooked spectrum, the various cooking methods.
Just like there's diversity, right? So during summer, during the hot heat months, probably better to have more raw foods and, just it's a cooler You know, we don't have to think about making sure that we digest that food as much, because we might be just more metabolically active and our digestion might be stronger. I think just getting a variety, like in the summertime, probably like 60% raw, 40% cooked, but then in the winter we flip-flop that a bit. And that just depends on what you're eating, right? Because you can't cook everything. You can't, you know, I'm not talking about cooking fruits as an example, and that's typically what we're eating more in the summer. So raw foods will give you more of the water-soluble nutrients, but what you won't get would be some of the fat-soluble nutrients. So let me just give you an example, like a carrot. You know, a carrot raw in its whole form, that's only going to give you a certain amount of, let's just say, beta carotene, which it can convert in your body to some extent to vitamin A. But if you cook it a little bit and you add a little bit of, whether it's extra virgin olive oil or whatever your choice of fat would be, you can help with the uptake of beta carotene. So some things work really well when they're cooked. And also, especially for high fiber foods, you obviously can't eat those raw. If you were to eat legumes raw, you could have a problem because of the lectins and some of the other things that could create an immune response. So you actually need to cook certain things. But again, I like something in the middle. Some things raw, most things steamed, and if you have to, designating a small percentage for the broiling, roasting, whether it's frying. Those are not my favorite methods because you're damaging the food. And when you damage the food, you're creating inflammation in your body. People ask me about air fryers. Again, it's frying. Anytime there's a color change in the food, then you know that there's been a change in the nutritional property of the food. So you want to have bright colors. So if you have broccoli, which already is pretty green, but then you steam it, you know how it gets really bright green? That's like when you want to eat it. But if you let the broccoli keep steaming and cooking, what happens? It loses its color. That's like the sign you've just lost some phytochemicals there, right? It's not optimal. Same thing with carrots, actually. You can cook carrots and kind of potentiate. One other, I would say, tip would be if you're having plants respond to stress, meaning that if you're chopping or shredding carrots or cutting the broccoli into small pieces or the garlic into small pieces or the onion into small pieces, and then you let it sit for a little bit, it actually causes the plant, which is still living, to create more phytochemicals. And it's doing that as a protective response for itself, but it actually is beneficial for us when we eat that. So especially like garlic, right? You know, you crush the garlic, you open up those cells, you allow things to interact. You let it sit out if you can, just for like, 15 to 30 minutes on the cutting board. Then you put it into the stir fry or whatever you're cooking. So the plant responds to that mechanical stress. So there was a publication which showed a whole carrot versus a sliced carrot versus a shredded carrot. Which one do you think had the most amount of nutrients?
We guess shredded based on what you just said.
Bingo. Yes, the shredded had 5 times the amount of phenolic acids, which is a form of a phytochemical. The shredded form, because there was more stress, right? The smaller you make the plant, the more that it's going to interact and see that as mechanical stress. And then it makes more phytochemicals. But you need to like let it sit for a little bit so it can do its magic and make those phytochemicals.
So have you shredded it, and then during this research, did they test to see whether freshly shredded versus shredded and then sitting for a half hour made a difference?
Not in this particular study, but I just know that from other studies where they looked at broccoli or garlic or onion, and it just makes sense, right? Because that reaction needs a little bit of time to happen. It's not like it's happening simultaneous with you cutting. You'll get some of that, but you also need to allow for the plant to kind of pick up that response.
Great. So keto versus plant-based. What are your thoughts on you know, in some way, shape, or form, keto or whatever they calling it at various times. There's the paleo, there's Atkins, there's South Beach, whatever that is, and then plant-based. There's been a battle between the two. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are it depends on the person. I don't certain diets can be I can take any one of those and find the form that would be like a healthy form overall and then an unhealthy form. You can have a modified ketogenic program, which would be really good for the mitochondria, neurological health, brain health, but it can also be done very poorly. And it can be done with a lot of processed foods. It could still be keto, just like you can have a vegan diet that can actually be very nutrient poor because it could just be like a lot of noodles and that would still be vegan, right? So it's more than just the diet. It is the person, it's the quality of the food, it is the diversity. Everything that I've talked about over this past 75 minutes is applies, right? It's like how that food was prepared, how it was processed. So I think it's a larger conversation, but I do lecture on that topic a lot because I feel that so many people are still very much locked into a diet. And for me, it's more about how can I help you to find your way to eating in a way that is personalized to your body, your environment, and your genes, right? I do think that there is a genetic component to looking at like what form of eating would serve somebody best. And even the elimination diet, I think out of any diet, the elimination diet is the best place to start because it really puts people on a level playing field. And sometimes you have to do that elimination diet like once a year, just for 3 weeks, just to kind of do a supercharge, just to kind of see where you're at with food and your body.
And what do we what do we need to get down to in order for it to be elimination diet? What do we need to remove and what can we keep?
Well, practitioners do that in a variety of different ways. If somebody is ready just to do it all, there are a number of things to remove, like corn, dairy, soy, pork. It also depends on how they eat, right? Also certain nuts. Well, I include sugar, alcohol, caffeine as part of that. So basically what they're having is protein, some kind of protein, healthy fats. They're having vegetables, they're having certain fruits. So they're focused on that for the period of like 3 weeks. And after that, foods. So for example, like I didn't mention gluten, but gluten would be one of those things that we're taking out. But for some people, they say, hey, Deanna, I mean, I'm never going to have gluten. I'm going gluten-free, so we don't have to add that back to see how I feel. So we add foods back, and then we try to figure out what is their personalized program based on the foods that they add back.
Great. So we're wrapping up. Any final thoughts for the audience before we end this panel this evening?
Well, again, just to summarize, again, eating the rainbow of colors and getting variety within each color. I do think that also, variety overall, making food fun and an experience, and noticing that the people that you eat with will inform your own eating behaviors. So in other words, if you have I would say a community of people that are eating like you, then chances are you'll continue to have that habit and that behavior. But sometimes it can become difficult for people to eat and be in a family or have friends where everybody's eating very differently, right? So you have to kind of try to find the common denominator of foods and do that as best you can. And just notice that, I mean, food just it's so powerful. It's medicine, it's healing, it's connection, it's energy, it's fuel. It's so many things to so many people. It's even spirituality. For some people, they might say grace, or they might set an intention before they eat. They thank the farmers. I mean, food is just so much, and we're taking in food several times a day. So I would say make the most out of it. Take it in for your physical body, take it in for your emotional health, your mental health, and even your spiritual health, and bring as much as you can the highest choices when at all possible into that experience.
Great, thank you. And before you go, can you let people know how to follow your work and how to get in contact with you?
Yeah, well, there you go. You've got it on the screen. That's my website. It's deannaminich.com. And on that website, DEANNAMINICH, you'll find, you see how you see blog up there? Go under resources and people will find a bunch of tools under downloads. You see the cards there, but under the downloads, I love educating. And so I have a whole bunch of things there that people can download, like recipes and Eat the Rainbow Toolkit. So have fun with that. And find me on social media because I have a Facebook group, I have a Facebook page, and I have an Instagram account.
Great, and very colorful site, so I appreciate that.
I hope so.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I was getting at with the rainbow philosophy. Well, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If we can unmute the audience. I mean, I saw you again.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Democrat.